The highway stretched endlessly under the darkening sky, a ribbon of asphalt that seemed to fade into oblivion. The landscape was barren, punctuated only by the occasional sagging telephone pole or derelict gas station. Liz, James, and their friend Kara were on their way to a music festival 3 states over, their old SUV rattling against the oppressive stillness of the desert. They hadn't seen another car for hours, and the setting sun cast long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. Kara tapped anxiously on her phone. "No signal," she muttered. "Relax," James said from the driver's seat, his voice laced with forced cheerfulness. "We'll hit civilization soon enough." Liz, sitting in the passenger seat, watched the horizon. Something didn't feel right. The road signs had grown sparse, and the last one they'd seen pointed them toward a town that wasn't on any of their maps. Ash Hollow, 15 miles. "Maybe we should have stopped back there," Liz said softly, glancing at James. "That place with the diner." James laughed. "That place looked like a death trap. We'll stop at the next one." But the next one never came. As twilight deepened, the road seemed to stretch on forever, a bleak expanse of nothingness. The SUV's engine began to cough and sputter. "Are you kidding me?" James groaned, thumping the steering wheel. The vehicle rolled to a halt. He popped the hood and got out, muttering curses as a cloud of steam rose from the engine. Kara leaned forward. "There's something weird about this place." Liz followed her gaze. A rusted road sign leaned precariously near the shoulder. "Welcome to Ash Hollow. Population 0. Below the text, a crude smiley face was spray-painted in red, its grin unsettlingly wide. "Population 0? Liz whispered. "That can't be right." James slammed the hood shut, his face pale. "The radiator's shot. We're not going anywhere." They sat in the suffocating silence, the encroaching darkness thick and oppressive. Then, like a whispered promise, headlights appeared on the horizon. The faint hum of an engine grew louder. "Finally," Kara said, relief washing over her face. She jumped out and waved her arms. "Hey! We need help!" The vehicle slowed as it approached. A battered pickup truck, its paint chipped and faded. The driver rolled down the window. He was an older man with a deeply lined face, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a stained cowboy hat. "Y'all lost?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Our car broke down," James said. "Is there a mechanic nearby?" The man smiled, a thin, humorless stretch of his lips. "Not much of anything nearby. Closest town's Ash Hollow, but you don't want to go there." "Why not?" Liz asked, her stomach knotting. The man's smile faded. "Ain't nobody there who'll help you." He tipped his hat and drove off, leaving them in the dust. They debated their options until Kara spotted faint lights in the distance. Against their better judgment, they decided to walk toward them. It was either that or spend the night stranded in the SUV. The walk was longer than they anticipated, and by the time they reached the outskirts of Ash Hollow, the temperature had dropped sharply. The town was eerily quiet. The buildings, weathered and decrepit, seemed frozen in time. A single street lamp flickered, casting jagged shadows. "This place feels wrong," Liz whispered. "Let's just find a phone," James said, his voice tense. The only open establishment was a general store, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Inside, the shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty cans and faded labels. Behind the counter stood a gaunt man with sunken eyes and an unsettlingly wide grin. "Evenin'," he drawled. "You folks lost?" Liz shivered. "Our car broke down. Is there a phone we can use?" The man's grin widened. "Phone's out of order, but I reckon you could stay the night at the inn, just down the road." James hesitated. "We'll figure something out." As they turned to leave, the man added, "Don't wander too far after dark. Strange things happen around here." The inn was little more than a crumbling 2-story house. The sign above the door swayed in the wind, its rusty chains creaking. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew. A frail woman greeted them, her eyes darting nervously as she handed them a single key. "Room 3, she whispered. "Lock the door." The room was sparse, just a bed, a rickety dresser, and a window that overlooked the empty street. As the hours dragged on, the silence became unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle seemed amplified. Then came the knocking, slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. James shot out of bed, his face pale. "Who's there?" No response. Just the knock, 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 louder now. Liz peeked through the peephole, her heart pounding. No one was there. "It's coming from inside," Kara whispered, pointing to the closet. James grabbed a heavy lamp as a makeshift weapon. He approached the closet door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He flung it open. Empty. A laugh echoed through the room, soft, childlike, and chilling. The lights flickered, and for a moment, Liz thought she saw a figure in the corner. A tall, shadowy silhouette with impossibly long limbs and glowing eyes. They didn't wait to find out more. Grabbing their bags, they bolted into the night. The town seemed alive now, windows lit up, shadows darting between buildings. A low hum filled the air, growing louder, like a swarm of bees. As they ran, the humming turned into whispers, voices calling their names in sing-song tones. The road out of town twisted and looped back on itself, trapping them in an endless maze of crumbling buildings and sinister shadows. By dawn, they found themselves back at the SUV, exhausted and trembling. The engine roared to life without hesitation, and they sped away without looking back. When they stopped hours later, finally reaching a bustling gas station, James tried to pull up the map on his phone. But Ash Hollow was gone. No town, no road, no sign it had ever existed. Only the faint sound of laughter echoed in Liz's mind, a reminder that some places aren't meant to be found, and once they find you, they never let go. The rain came down in sheets, turning the mountain road into a slick, treacherous path. Amanda gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Beside her, her husband, Derek, squinted into the gloom, the faint beam of the headlights barely cutting through the mist. "Do you even know where we are?" Derek asked, his voice tinged with irritation. Amanda shot him a glare. "The GPS said this is the way to the cabin." "The GPS also lost signal an hour ago," Derek muttered. "We should have stayed on the main road." As they rounded a tight corner, the car's tires skidded on the wet asphalt. Amanda yanked the wheel, her heart hammering. The car came to a halt just inches from the edge of the steep cliff. Below, the black forest stretched endlessly, shrouded in fog. "I'm done," Derek said, throwing open the door. "I'm checking the map." "No, stay in the car," Amanda pleaded. "Let's just—" Her words were cut short as a flash of movement caught her eye. Something darted across the road ahead, faster than she could process. It was large, too large to be an animal, and moved with an unnatural fluidity. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Derek froze. "See what?" "There was something," he sighed. "Probably a deer." But his tone betrayed uncertainty. Derek stepped out into the rain, the map crinkling in his hands. The wind howled, carrying with it an eerie whistling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Amanda rolled down her window slightly. "Just hurry up," she called. "This place is freaking me out." As Derek leaned over the hood to study the map, the whistling grew louder. It was almost melodic, like a mournful tune being played on an ancient flute. Amanda's stomach twisted as a chill settled over the air. Suddenly, Derek stiffened. He turned his head slowly, staring into the woods. Amanda followed his gaze, but the trees were nothing more than blackened silhouettes in the mist. "What is it?" she asked, panic rising in her throat. "I thought I saw. Never mind." His voice was flat, distant. He folded the map and got back in the car, slamming the door shut. "Let's keep moving." As Amanda shifted into gear, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing on the side of the road. Tall and impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Derek," she started, but when she looked again, the figure was gone. The road twisted deeper into the forest, the trees pressing closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The whistling returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from inside the car, though Amanda and Derek exchanged terrified glances, neither willing to voice it. "We need to stop," Derek finally said. "I don't think we're going the right way." Before Amanda could respond, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging them into total darkness. "No," Amanda whispered, turning the key again and again. The engine refused to start. "Great," Derek muttered, fumbling for his phone. "Of course, no signal." The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Amanda's breathing grew shallow as she scanned the woods outside. Shadows shifted unnaturally, like the forest was alive and watching. Then came the knocking. It started softly, tapping on the rear window. Derek spun around, his eyes wide. What the hell was that? Before Amanda could answer, the knocking moved, now at the driver's side window. Amanda screamed, pressing her back against the seat. There was no one there, just the rain streaking down the glass. The tapping grew louder, frantic, as if dozens of hands were pounding on every surface of the car. The roof dented inward slightly, as though something heavy was pressing down. Derek grabbed Amanda's arm. "Get out! We have to run!" "No," she cried. "We don't even know what's out there." As if in response, the car suddenly shook violently, throwing Amanda and Derek against their seats. A guttural, inhuman growl filled the air, vibrating through their bones. "Run!" Derek shouted, flinging his door open. Amanda hesitated for a split second before following him into the storm. The cold rain lashed against her face as they sprinted toward the tree line, their shoes slipping on the muddy ground. Behind them, the car groaned and creaked, the sound of metal twisting and snapping echoing through the night. They didn't dare look back. The forest offered no refuge. The whistling returned, softer now, weaving through the trees like a predator circling its prey. Amanda clung to Derek, her chest heaving with sobs. "What is that?" she cried. "I don't know," he yelled, his voice breaking. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, roots tangling and tripping them. Amanda fell hard, her palms scraping against the jagged rocks. Derek helped her up, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "There's something behind us," he whispered. Amanda turned slowly. In the distance, barely visible through the rain and fog, was the figure. It was closer now, its elongated limbs swaying unnaturally, its head cocked to the side as if studying them. Then it took a step forward, and another. It didn't walk so much as glide, its movements impossibly smooth. Amanda and Derek bolted, their panic driving them deeper into the forest. The thing followed, its pace unhurried yet relentless. The whistling grew louder, drowning out their ragged breaths. Amanda's vision blurred as adrenaline coursed through her veins. She didn't see the edge of the ravine until it was too late. She screamed as she tumbled down the slope, branches clawing at her arms and legs. She hit the bottom with a sickening thud, pain radiating through her body. Derek landed beside her, groaning in agony. Above them, the figure stood at the edge, silhouetted against the gray sky. Its glowing eyes bored into them as it began to descend the ravine with unnatural ease. Amanda grabbed Derek's hand. "We have to keep moving." But Derek didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the figure, his lips moving soundlessly. Amanda shook him, but it was no use. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The last thing Amanda heard before the darkness consumed her was the whistling, closer now, almost tender, a lullaby meant for the damned. The snowstorm came without warning, a whiteout that swallowed the winding mountain road in minutes. Greg, Naomi, and their son Ethan were on their way to a remote ski lodge for the weekend, their excitement now replaced with tension as the snowfall thickened. "I told you we should have left earlier," Naomi said, her voice tight. Greg gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. "How was I supposed to know the weather would turn this fast?" From the back seat, Ethan piped up, his voice small. "Are we going to get stuck?" "No, buddy," Greg assured him, but even he didn't believe it. The tires struggled for traction as the SUV crept forward. They hadn't seen another car for miles. Then, through the swirling snow, a faint glow appeared ahead. "There's a building," Naomi said, relief washing over her. "Maybe we can wait out the storm there." The glow resolved into a neon sign, Cold Pines Motel. Beneath it, the letters flickered erratically. Vacancy. The parking lot was empty, the surrounding pines bending under the weight of the snow. The building itself was small and shabby, its paint peeling under layers of frost. Greg hesitated but pulled in. Better than being stuck out here. The family trudged inside, shaking off the snow. The lobby was dimly lit, with faded wallpaper and an old radio playing a static-filled tune. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a tired smile. "Rough night, huh?" she said. "Lucky you found us. Storm like this, people disappear." Naomi frowned. "Disappear?" The woman waved a hand dismissively. "Just an expression. Room for 3? Greg nodded. "Yeah, just for the night." The woman slid a key across the counter, her hand lingering for a moment. "Room 5. Heat's a little iffy, but it's cozy enough." The room was at the far end of the hall, its door sticking as Greg pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. The furnishings were basic. A single queen bed, a threadbare armchair, and a cracked mirror above a small dresser. Naomi wrinkled her nose. "Charming." "It's just one night," Greg said, dropping their bags. He turned to Ethan. "Why don't you get some sleep, buddy?" Ethan crawled onto the bed without argument, pulling the scratchy blanket up to his chin. Greg and Naomi sat in the armchair, flipping through an old travel magazine to pass the time. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, barely audible over the wind howling outside. Greg glanced at the door. Probably just the storm. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. "I'll check," Greg said, standing up. He opened the door a crack and peered out. No one was there. "What is it?" Naomi asked. "Nothing," Greg replied, shutting the door. But as he turned away, the knocking resumed, this time on the window. Naomi screamed. Greg spun around, his heart racing. The curtains swayed slightly as if disturbed by a breeze. He moved cautiously toward the window and pulled them back. Nothing. Just snow swirling in the darkness. "This place is creepy," Naomi whispered. "Maybe we should just sleep in the car." Greg was about to agree when Ethan sat up suddenly, his eyes wide and unblinking. "They're here," he said in a flat voice. Greg and Naomi exchanged a look. "Who's here, buddy?" Greg asked, his voice shaky. Ethan pointed toward the corner of the room. The tall man. Naomi turned slowly. The corner was empty, but the air felt wrong, heavier, colder. "There's no one there," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't respond. He just stared, his finger still pointing. Greg crossed the room and waved his hand through the air, trying to dispel the unease. "See? It's nothing." But the moment he stepped into the corner, the lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness, and Naomi screamed. When the lights returned, Ethan was standing in the middle of the room, his expression blank. "Ethan?" Naomi rushed to him, shaking his shoulders. "What are you doing?" He blinked and looked up at her, confused. "Mom, what's wrong?" "You were—" She started but stopped when Greg grabbed her arm. "Let's leave, now," he said. They hurriedly packed their bags, Greg keeping a watchful eye on the room's shadows. The metallic smell was stronger now, almost suffocating. As they opened the door, the hallway seemed longer than before, stretching into darkness. Naomi held Ethan's hand tightly as they moved toward the lobby. The air grew colder with every step, their breaths visible in the dim light. The radio's static-filled tune grew louder, warped and discordant. When they reached the lobby, it was empty. The woman at the desk was gone, and the front door was ajar, snow blowing inside. They ran for the car, the wind biting at their faces. Greg fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he started the engine. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Naomi glanced back. The motel was gone. In its place stood a burned-out shell of a building, its charred timbers barely visible through the snow. Greg slammed on the brakes. "What the hell?" "That can't be," Naomi began, but a movement in the rearview mirror cut her off. Ethan was staring out the back window, his eyes wide with terror. "He's following us." Naomi turned, her heart sinking. In the distance, a tall figure stood in the snow, its silhouette unnaturally long and thin. As the car sped away, it didn't move, but it didn't need to. Its presence clung to them, an unshakable weight. They didn't stop until they reached the next town. The bright lights of a gas station a welcome relief. Inside, Greg approached the clerk, his voice shaking. "Do you know anything about a place called Cold Pines Motel?" The clerk's face went pale. "That place burned down years ago. Everyone who stayed there never made it out." Greg felt the blood drain from his face. "But we were just—" The clerk cut him off, his eyes narrowing. "You need to leave. Now. And don't look back." They did as he said, driving through the night in silence. But as the miles passed, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't left the motel behind, and neither had the tall man. The road to Black Hollow Lake was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. Sarah, Mark, and their friend Kelly had rented a cabin there for a weekend escape from the chaos of the city. The directions on the old paper map had led them down a narrow dirt road, flanked by looming pines that seemed to close in the farther they drove. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Kelly asked, her voice uneasy. She was in the back seat, craning her neck to peer out into the gathering dusk. Mark, at the wheel, laughed nervously. "It's supposed to be remote. That's the whole point, right? No cell service, no distractions." Sarah frowned at the map in her lap. "This is definitely the road. The listing said the cabin would be right by the lake." As the car rounded a bend, the lake came into view, its surface glassy and black under the fading light. The cabin stood a short distance from the water, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. The place was smaller than they'd expected, weathered and leaning slightly to one side as if it had been abandoned for years. "This doesn't look like the pictures," Kelly said, her unease growing. "It's fine," Mark said, forcing a grin. "We're here to rough it, right?" They unloaded their bags and headed inside. The cabin's interior was musty, with furniture covered in white sheets that billowed slightly in the draft. An old stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a single dusty window offered a view of the lake. "Home sweet home," Mark said, trying to lighten the mood. Sarah peeled back a sheet to reveal a threadbare couch. "It's rustic," she said diplomatically. As they settled in, night fell quickly. Mark lit a fire and they played cards, trying to laugh off the eerie atmosphere. But the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the window panes. Kelly broke the silence. "Did you hear that?" Mark paused, listening. "Probably just the wind." "No," Kelly said, her voice trembling. "It sounded like footsteps." The laughter died. They all strained to listen, and sure enough, there it was, the unmistakable crunch of snow outside, slow and deliberate. Mark stood, grabbing the flashlight from the mantel. "I'll check it out." "Don't," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "It's probably just an animal." But Mark was already at the door. He stepped outside, and the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The snow was untouched, the wind carrying only silence now. He turned back to the cabin. Then he saw them, footprints in the snow circling the cabin, perfectly spaced as if someone or something had walked a slow, deliberate path around the entire structure. Mark's stomach tightened as he realized the tracks weren't there when they arrived. He hurried back inside, locking the door behind him. There's tracks out there. They're fresh." Sarah and Kelly stared at him, their faces pale. "From what?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Mark admitted, "but there's no one out there now." They tried to shake it off, but the unease lingered. They decided to sleep in the same room, pushing the couch and an old chair close to the fireplace. The fire's glow was comforting, but as the hours ticked by, the howling wind seemed to take on a voice of its own, whispering just beyond the walls. Around 2 a.m., Sarah woke to a faint tapping sound. She sat up, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, almost polite. She shook Mark awake. "Listen." He groggily sat up, and the tapping stopped. "It's nothing," he mumbled, pulling her back down. But Sarah couldn't sleep. She stared at the window, watching the shadows shift in the firelight. Then, without warning, the tapping resumed. Louder now, more insistent. Mark and Kelly both bolted upright. "What the hell is that?" Kelly whispered. Mark grabbed the flashlight again and shone it at the window. For a moment, they saw nothing. Then a face appeared. It wasn't human. The thing outside had skin as pale as the snow, stretched tight over a long angular skull. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its mouth was a jagged slash that stretched too wide. It stared at them, unmoving, as the tapping continued, now with long, clawed fingers. "Get away from the window!" Sarah screamed, dragging Kelly back. Mark slammed the curtains shut, his hands shaking. The tapping stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy dragging across the roof. "Did it climb up there?" Kelly whimpered, clutching Sarah. Mark grabbed the poker from the fireplace, his voice trembling. "We're not staying here." "But it's outside," Sarah protested. "We can't leave." The dragging sound moved to the far side of the cabin, then stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the scratching, slow and deliberate, like nails on wood, tracing along the walls. "We need to go. Now," Mark said. They grabbed their bags and bolted for the car. The snowstorm had intensified, the wind biting at their faces as they stumbled through the drifts. Mark fumbled with the keys, his breath visible in frantic bursts. As they piled into the car, Sarah glanced back at the cabin. The thing stood in the doorway, its elongated frame barely fitting within the frame. It didn't chase them, it just watched, its head tilting unnaturally as they sped away. They didn't stop driving until dawn, when they reached a small town miles away. At a diner, they tried to explain what had happened to the locals. An older man at the counter listened intently, his face grim. "You went to Black Hollow Lake?" Mark nodded. "You're lucky you got out," the man said. "That place has been cursed for decades. People go there and never come back. They say something lives in those woods, something ancient." Kelly shivered. "What is it?" The man shrugged. "No one knows. But it doesn't like visitors." They left the diner in silence, the man's words echoing in their minds. None of them ever spoke of the cabin again, but Sarah couldn't forget the thing's face, the hollow eyes, the too wide mouth. Sometimes in the dead of night, she swore she could still hear the tapping. The highway stretched endlessly through the desert, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through an expanse of desolation. Emma, Chris and their friend Rachel were on their way to a music festival in the next state over. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the road bathed in an eerie, moonlit glow. "Are we sure we're still on the right highway?" Rachel asked from the back seat. She glanced nervously at the GPS, which had lost signal miles ago. "Yeah," Chris said, though his confidence wavered. The map said this is the shortcut. Emma, riding shotgun, squinted at the horizon. "It's weird. There hasn't been another car for ages. You'd think this road would be more popular." Chris shrugged. "It's late. Maybe everyone's already there." The car hummed along, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Emma glanced at her phone. No bars. "Figures," she muttered. Then she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. "Chris, stop!" she yelled. Chris slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just feet from the figure. It was a man, barefoot and dressed in tattered clothes. His face was hidden in shadow, but his posture was unnerving. His head tilted to one side, his arms hanging limply. "What the hell?" Chris said, his heart racing. The man didn't move. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his silhouette outlined by the car's high beams. "Is he hurt?" Rachel whispered. Emma rolled down the window a crack. "Are you okay?" she called out. The man's head snapped toward her, too fast to be natural. Emma recoiled, her hand darting to the window controls. "Just drive," she said urgently. Chris didn't argue. He eased the car around the man, who remained rooted in place, his head following their movements. As they sped away, Emma glanced in the side mirror. The man hadn't moved, but somehow he was closer to the car than before, his figure still illuminated in the red glow of the taillights. "That's impossible," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "Did he follow us?" Rachel asked, peering through the rear window. "No," Chris said. But the mood in the car had shifted. The endless stretch of road seemed darker now, the desert outside impossibly quiet. Even the stars felt distant. An hour later, the headlights picked up something ahead, a shape lying across the road. "Another one?" Rachel asked, her voice rising in panic. "No, it's not a person," Emma said. What is that?" As they got closer, it became clear. It was a dead animal. A large one, its body mangled and spread across both lanes. Chris slowed the car to a crawl, the tires crunching over scattered debris. "Looks like a coyote," Chris said, though his voice lacked certainty. "Why is it so torn apart?" Emma asked, her stomach turning. They maneuvered around the carcass and picked up speed, but the tension in the car was palpable. Rachel turned her head toward the window and froze. "Guys, there's someone out there." Chris and Emma both looked. In the darkness just beyond the shoulder of the road, figures stood scattered among the desert shrubs. They weren't moving, but their presence was unmistakable, silhouettes against the pale sand barely visible in the moonlight. "How many are there?" Emma whispered, her chest tightening. "I don't know," Rachel said. "A dozen? Maybe more?" The figures didn't follow, but their stillness was somehow worse. It felt like being watched by predators waiting for the right moment to strike. "Keep driving," Emma said. "Don't stop." Chris pressed harder on the gas, the engine whining as the car sped down the road. The figures receded into the distance, but no one in the car felt any relief. Minutes passed, in silence. Then the radio crackled to life. Static hissed through the speakers, followed by a voice, low, distorted, and whispering words they couldn't understand. Chris reached to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was shouting in a language none of them recognized. Emma covered her ears, her head pounding. "Make it stop," Rachel screamed. The radio cut out abruptly, leaving the car in oppressive silence once more. Chris's hands trembled on the wheel. "That's it," he said. "As soon as we find somewhere to stop, I'm done with this road." Emma nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "There's got to be something. A gas station, a motel, anything." But the road remained empty. The desert stretched on, endless and unchanging. Just when it seemed like they'd never find another sign of civilization, a flickering light appeared in the distance. "There," Rachel said. "Do you see it?" Chris squinted. It was a small, weathered gas station, its single fluorescent sign barely illuminating the pumps. It looked abandoned, but they had no other choice. As they pulled into the lot, the engine sputtered and died. "What the?" Chris turned the key, but the car wouldn't start. "No, no, no," Rachel muttered, her panic rising. "Let's just go inside," Emma said, trying to stay calm. "Maybe someone can help." The three of them climbed out, the cold desert air biting at their skin. The gas station was eerily silent, its windows dark. Chris pushed open the door, and a bell jingled faintly. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. Inside, the shelves were covered in dust, and the air smelled of mildew. A single light flickered above the counter, casting long shadows. I don't like this, Rachel said, clutching Emma's arm. Chris walked to the counter and leaned over. There's no one here. Then the bell jingled again. They all turned toward the door, but no one had entered. The door was shut tight. Let's leave, Emma whispered. As they turned to head back to the car, the radio behind the counter crackled to life. The same distorted voice from before filled the air, whispering and laughing. The lights flickered violently, and the bell rang again, this time accompanied by the sound of footsteps. Run, Chris yelled. They bolted for the car, yanking open the doors and piling in. Chris turned the key frantically, and the engine roared to life. He floored the gas pedal, and they sped away from the gas station. In the rearview mirror, Emma saw them. Figures lined the road behind them, standing shoulder to shoulder. At the center was the man from before, his head tilted at the same unnatural angle, his mouth moving as if speaking the words that had haunted the radio. They didn't stop driving until dawn, when they reached the edge of the desert and the safety of a small diner. Inside, they recounted their story to the waitress, who listened with wide eyes. You were on Devil's Stretch, she said. Locals don't drive that road at night. They say it's cursed, full of spirits looking for company. Chris, Emma, and Rachel didn't respond. They just stared at their untouched coffee, their minds replaying the faces they had seen in the darkness. They never spoke of the trip again. But at night, Emma sometimes heard the voice from the radio, whispering her name. The sky was a deep bruised purple as Sam, Lila, and Jake drove down the forgotten highway known as Route 44, a desolate stretch that cut through endless woods. They were college friends on their way to a friend's cabin, but they'd taken a wrong turn hours ago, and now they were hopelessly lost in a maze of trees. Are you sure this is the right way? Lila asked from the back seat, her voice tense. She had a map spread across her lap, but it was useless. The last mile marker they'd seen was faded and illegible. I'm just following the road, Sam said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Jake, riding shotgun, stared out the window, his eyes narrowed. Does anyone else feel like the woods are getting closer? Lila looked up and realized he was right. The trees seemed to be pressing in, their branches bending toward the road as if reaching out to pull them in. We need to turn around, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sam nodded. He slowed the car, looking for a place to make a U-turn, when the headlights illuminated something up ahead. It was a house, tall and narrow, like it had been stretched upward. It sat back from the road, half hidden by overgrown bushes and towering pines. Maybe they can help, Jake suggested. Ask for directions? Sam hesitated, but they were miles from anywhere, and their phones had lost signal hours ago. He pulled over, and they climbed out of the car, the air cold and still. The house looked even stranger up close. The windows were black voids, and the wood was dark and rotting. A thin trail led from the road to the front door, and without a word, the three of them made their way up. Lila stopped. Wait. Look. There was a lantern hanging from the porch, a faint orange glow flickering inside it. Someone was home. They knocked, the sound dull and muffled. A minute passed, then 2. Jake reached for the doorknob, but it creaked open before he touched it. Hello? He called into the darkness. No answer. I don't like this, Lila whispered. But Sam stepped forward, peering inside. The interior was dimly lit, and the walls were covered in faded wallpaper that peeled in long strips. It smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like rusted metal. There might be a phone, Sam said. They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing through the quiet. The door creaked shut behind them, and when they turned, they saw it had no knob on the inside. We'll just find a phone and get out, Jake said, his voice faltering. The hallway led to a parlor, where ancient, dust-covered furniture sat in strange configurations, facing inward, like a crowd gathered around something invisible in the middle. A chill ran through Lila as she saw a series of portraits hanging on the walls. Each face was turned slightly away from the viewer, painted in profile as if they were looking at something just out of sight. That's odd, she murmured, pointing at the paintings. They moved into the next room, and there it was again. A lantern hanging in the middle of the room, flickering softly. The light cast long, twisted shadows that danced across the walls. Jake reached out, touching it, and felt an unnatural chill spread from his fingers. Who lights these? He wondered aloud. As they moved deeper into the house, the rooms began to feel smaller, the ceilings lower. The walls seemed to shift, pressing inward, and they realized the floor was sloping, leading them gradually down as if the house itself was guiding them. "We need to get out of here," Sam said, his voice shaking. He turned back, but the hallway they'd come from was gone. Instead, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. Was that here before?" Lila asked, her voice barely a whisper. They had no choice but to follow the stairs down. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp earth grew stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a long, narrow room lined with mirrors. Each one was covered with a thin layer of dust, distorting their reflections. Jake stepped forward, wiping the dust off one mirror. His face stared back, but something was wrong. The eyes in the reflection were wide and terrified, the mouth twisted in a silent scream. He stumbled back, his heart pounding. "What was that?" he gasped. Lila covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The other mirrors held similar reflections, each one of them trapped in some kind of silent, horrific scene. In one, Sam's reflection clawed at the glass, eyes frantic. In another, Lila's reflection stood in darkness, a shadowy figure looming behind her. "This isn't real," Sam whispered, but even he sounded unconvinced. As they moved past the mirrors, they noticed something else. Someone had scratched words into the glass of each mirror. "They see you," read one. "Don't turn around," read another. They hurried to the end of the room where a single door awaited. Jake pushed it open, and they found themselves in a small, cramped cellar. In the center of the room was a well, an ancient stone structure with rotting wood covering its top. "No way," Sam muttered. This isn't possible." They heard it then, a soft, muffled scratching coming from the well. "Let's get out of here," Lila said, her voice high-pitched with fear. But the door behind them was gone, replaced by a solid wall. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then a voice drifted up from the well, a whisper so soft it was almost inaudible. It was calling their names. Lila shook her head, backing away. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." Jake grabbed her arm. "Stay together. We'll find a way out." As they turned, something shifted in the shadows near the well. A figure slowly rose from the darkness, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs elongated and twisting at unnatural angles. Its face was a featureless expanse of pale skin, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, as if it were a puppet on invisible strings. "Run!" Sam shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The figure took a shuddering step toward them, its head tilting, a mouthless face stretching in a silent scream. Behind it, more shapes began to emerge from the shadows, all moving in the same twisted, unnatural manner. They backed against the wall, their breaths shallow and panicked. The room seemed to stretch, growing darker, the figures looming closer. Then, just as they were about to lose hope, they heard it. A distant sound, faint but unmistakable. A car horn blaring from outside. The room snapped back to its original shape, the figures vanishing. The door appeared again, just as it had been before. Without thinking, they bolted for it, racing up the stairs, through the hallways, past the silent, empty portraits. They threw themselves out the front door and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. They didn't look back as they ran to the car, jumping inside. Sam turned the key, and the engine roared to life. They tore down the road, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror. As they reached the main highway, Lila looked back one last time. The house stood in the distance, its silhouette dark and motionless. But just before it disappeared from view, she saw it. One of the figures standing on the porch, watching them leave. It raised a hand, waving slowly as if bidding them farewell. They drove in silence, the horror of the night lingering with them, none of them daring to look back again. But deep down, they knew they'd never truly left that house behind. They would carry its memory with them, an unwelcome guest, haunting their dreams. And sometimes late at night they would hear it, a soft scratching sound coming from the walls, whispering their names. They called it Devil's Bend, a narrow stretch of road winding through the thick, fog-shrouded forest just outside of town. It was infamous for its sharp curves, frequent accidents, and strange tales that seemed to linger around it like the mist itself. Ellie, Nate, and Carrie had heard about it all their lives but never dared to explore it until now. It was Halloween night and they were bored, looking for a thrill. "Come on, just once around the bend," Nate urged, grinning. Everyone says it's haunted. Let's see if anything actually happens. Carrie looked nervously out the car window at the trees stretching into blackness. They say people go missing out here. Yeah, and no one ever finds them, Ellie added, half joking but unnerved by her own words. Still, they decided to go through with it. Nate put the car in drive, and they started down the narrow, twisting road. The fog was thick, rolling across the asphalt like an otherworldly sea, and Ellie noticed that the further they drove, the quieter it got. No sounds of insects or night birds, just the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The car's headlights barely cut through the mist, creating a strange, surreal tunnel of light. For a moment, they drove in silence, watching the dark road ahead, waiting for something to happen. Then they saw the first sign. A hand-painted wooden sign, leaning at an odd angle, appeared on the right side of the road. It read, "Turn back. Danger ahead." "Did you know this was here?" Carrie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nate shook his head. "Nope, but it's probably just someone trying to scare people." They drove on, but only a few yards further, another sign appeared. This one was older, its paint peeling and faded, but still legible. "Keep going and you'll never come back." Ellie shivered. "Who puts these signs up? Should we really keep going?" "Come on, it's just to spook people," Nate said, but there was an edge in his voice, a crack in his confidence. He tightened his grip on the wheel, speeding up as the fog thickened around them. A few moments later, they saw something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Nate slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop just a few feet from the figure. It was a woman dressed in white, her hair hanging over her face, her body unnaturally still. "Is that a person?" Carrie whispered, frozen in her seat. Ellie leaned forward, squinting. The woman didn't move. She was just standing there, facing them, her hands at her sides, her hair covering her eyes. Nate honked the horn, but the woman didn't react. She just remained in place, as if waiting for them. "Go around her," Ellie urged, her heart pounding. Nate took a deep breath, gripping the wheel, and carefully maneuvered around her, his eyes never leaving the figure. As they passed her, Ellie dared a glance back. The woman's head turned slowly to follow them, her face hidden in shadow, but her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, watching them leave. As they drove on, Carrie checked her phone. "I've got no service," she said, her voice shaking. "Me neither," Ellie replied, staring out into the fog, feeling a growing sense of dread. Nate glanced at the rearview mirror. "Is she still there?" They all looked back. The woman was gone. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, but no matter how far they went, the road just kept twisting and turning, always curving back into the fog. There were no landmarks, no mile markers, just an endless stretch of empty, winding road. "Are we going in circles?" Ellie finally asked. "I don't know," Nate replied, his voice tense. "This doesn't make any sense. We should have hit the end of the road by now." Then they saw another sign. This one was new, freshly painted in red. "Welcome back." "Welcome back to what?" Carrie whispered, clutching her phone. Ellie's stomach twisted as she looked out the window. The trees seemed darker, thicker, pressing closer to the road. She glanced behind them and noticed something chilling. Deep in the fog, she could see faint outlines of figures, standing among the trees, just out of reach of the headlights. They were barely visible, but they were there, unmoving, watching. "Do you guys see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nate looked into the rearview mirror and went pale. "What are they?" The figures were getting closer, slowly emerging from the fog, their shapes becoming clearer. There were men, women, even children, all dressed in old, tattered clothes, their faces expressionless, their eyes hollow and dark. "Keep driving, Nate," Carrie screamed, her voice rising to a panic. Nate floored the gas pedal and the car lurched forward. But no matter how fast they went, the figures kept pace, gliding through the trees, their blank eyes fixed on the car. Then the radio crackled to life, filling the car with static. A distorted voice whispered through the noise, its tone flat and mechanical. "You're on the road now. The road has you. The road doesn't let go." "What is that?" Ellie gasped, frantically pressing buttons on the radio, but it wouldn't turn off. The voice grew louder, repeating its eerie chant, as if the road itself was speaking to them. "The road doesn't let go. The road doesn't let go." Carrie covered her ears, her face pale with terror. "Make it stop, please." Suddenly, the headlights flickered, plunging them into darkness for a moment before the lights blinked back on. When the road reappeared in front of them, their blood ran cold. The woman in white was standing in the middle of the road again, closer than before, her eyes fixed on the car. This time, her mouth was open in a wide, silent scream, as if she were calling out to them without sound. Nate swerved to avoid her, the car veering off the road and skidding to a stop in the gravel. They sat in stunned silence, panting, as the radio went dead and the fog thickened around them, pressing in from all sides. Then a soft tapping came from outside the car. They looked up to see figures pressing their hands against the windows, faces blank and expressionless, their eyes dark voids. One by one, they surrounded the car, silent and still, as if waiting for something. Nate tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. His hands were shaking, his breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. "No, no, come on!" The figures began tapping, slow and rhythmic, their fingers leaving smudges on the glass. The woman in white was there too, her face pressed against the windshield, her empty eyes staring directly at Nate, her mouth moving soundlessly as if whispering to him. Carrie began to sob, covering her face, and Ellie grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. Then, in the distance, they heard it. A faint sound, like the rumble of another car coming down the road. The figures paused, their heads turning toward the sound. The rumble grew louder, headlights cutting through the fog from behind them. The figures stepped back, melting into the shadows as the approaching vehicle drew closer. The lights grew brighter, illuminating the car as it pulled up alongside them. An old pickup truck stopped next to them, its driver a grizzled man with a weathered face. He leaned out of the window, his expression grave. "You kids lost?" Nate nodded, his voice trembling. "Please, can you help us? We've been stuck on this road for hours." The man's eyes narrowed. "You took Devil's Bend, didn't you?" Nate swallowed hard. "Yeah, how did you know?" The man sighed, looking past them down the road. "Most don't make it out once they're on it. The road has a way of keeping people." He motioned for them to follow him. "I'll lead you back. Don't look back, and whatever you do, don't stop until you see the lights of town." Without another word, the man drove off, his taillights glowing faintly in the mist. Nate started the car, and to his relief, the engine roared to life. They pulled back onto the road, following the pickup closely, never looking back at the figures that lingered in the fog. The drive felt endless, but eventually they saw the distant glow of streetlights. They crossed the town line, the mist lifting as they reached the safety of civilization. Nate parked the car, and they all sat in silence, unable to process what they'd just experienced. When they looked for the pickup, it was gone, as if it had vanished into thin air. But they never forgot the road, or the figures in the fog, or the whispered chant that would haunt their dreams. The road doesn't let go. The desolate stretch of Interstate 85 between midnight and dawn had a reputation, a place truckers whispered about and avoided if they could. Locals called it the Phantom Mile, a stretch of road that wasn't marked on any map and seemed to appear only when the conditions were just right. Few who entered ever made it to the other side, and the ones who did weren't the same afterward. Evan and his fiancée, Lisa, were driving through the area, heading to her parents' house in Georgia. They'd left late, and the GPS suggested a shortcut down a side road that cut across the interstate. It was Evan who noticed the first oddity. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight. Lisa looked up from her phone. "See what?" "The mile marker we just passed." "It was blank." Lisa frowned. "You're tired. You probably misread it." Evan didn't argue, but unease curled in his gut as the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the world around them swallowed by a heavy mist. The trees lining the road looked strange, their silhouettes almost humanoid, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. The radio, which had been softly playing an oldies station, began to crackle, the music fading to static. Lisa tried fiddling with it, but it wouldn't tune to any channel. "Great," she muttered, sitting back. Minutes passed, and they both realized something else. They hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour. No headlights, no taillights, not even a roadside sign. It was as if they were driving through a vacuum. The GPS pinged. A new route had appeared, a direct line to their destination, the shortcut. "Should we trust it?" Lisa asked, her voice uncertain. Evan hesitated, but eventually turned onto the suggested road. The pavement was cracked, the edges crumbling into dirt, and the trees pressed closer, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. The headlights barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead, the mist thickening around them. They drove in tense silence until a figure appeared in the distance. "Is that someone walking?" Lisa asked, squinting. It was. A man was trudging down the middle of the road, his movements slow and heavy. Evan slowed the car, hesitating. Don't stop, Lisa said quickly, gripping his arm. This feels wrong. But Evan couldn't just drive past. The man looked disoriented, his clothes tattered and caked in dirt. Evan rolled down the window slightly as they approached. Hey, are you okay? Do you need help? The man turned, and both Evan and Lisa gasped. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken and lifeless. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, his jaw unhinged unnaturally wide, and he let out a raspy, guttural gasp. Then, without warning, he lunged at the car. Go! Lisa screamed. Evan slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as the car shot forward. In the rearview mirror, the man stood motionless in the middle of the road, his head tilted unnaturally, watching them speed away. The road grew darker, the mist now swirling with strange shapes, shadows that darted and flickered at the edges of their vision. The car's headlights flickered, the beams dimming for a heartbeat before coming back stronger. What is this place? Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. Evan didn't answer. He was focused on the road, trying to ignore the shapes that seemed to be moving just beyond the tree line. Then they saw it, a house in the distance, its windows glowing faintly. Should we stop there? Lisa asked, though she already dreaded the answer. We might not have a choice, Evan replied, his voice strained. As they pulled up to the house, it became clear that it was old, too old. The wood was warped and splintered, the roof sagging. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, yet the lights inside burned steadily. Stay here, Evan said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. Like hell I will! Lisa snapped, climbing out after him. The air was thick and heavy, and the faint smell of decay lingered. They approached the porch cautiously, the wood creaking under their weight. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. Hello? Evan called out, his voice echoing eerily. No answer. Lisa grabbed his arm. This isn't right. We shouldn't be here. But Evan stepped inside, shining the flashlight around. The interior was sparse, the furniture covered in dusty sheets. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its hands spinning wildly, faster than time itself. Then they heard it, a soft, wet sound coming from upstairs. Someone's up there, Lisa whispered. Or something, Evan muttered, his throat dry. Against every instinct, they climbed the staircase, the wooden steps groaning under their weight. At the top, the hallway stretched unnaturally long, lined with doors on either side. The sound grew louder, a wet, dragging noise like something heavy being pulled across the floor. One of the doors at the far end creaked open. Let's go back, Lisa begged, tugging at Evan's sleeve. But before they could move, the door nearest to them slammed shut, followed by another, then another, the sound echoing down the hallway like a cascade of thunder. A low growl came from behind them. They turned, and at the bottom of the stairs stood the man from the road, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his hollow eyes fixed on them. He started to climb the stairs, his movements jerky and inhuman. Run, Evan yelled, grabbing Lisa's hand. They bolted down the hallway, throwing open the nearest door and slamming it behind them. The room was pitch black, but when Evan turned on the flashlight, the beam revealed dozens of faces staring back at them. Photos lined the walls, each one depicting the same man at different ages, standing in front of the same house. In the last photo, the man stood with two new faces, Evan and Lisa. The door rattled violently, the handle twisting. Then the growl came again, deeper this time, a sound that vibrated through their bones. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Lisa screamed, and the door burst open. Something massive and cold lunged at them, and then there was nothing. When police found the car abandoned weeks later, it was parked at a turnout off Interstate 85. The engine was still running, the headlights pointed at a dense patch of trees, but Evan and Lisa were never found. Drivers on that stretch of road still report strange sightings. Two figures walking side by side in the mist, their faces pale and unrecognizable, forever lost on the Phantom Mile. The diner was a relic from another time. A squat, chrome-plated building squatting alone on a deserted highway. Its neon sign flickered weakly in the misty night. Last Stop Cafe, open 24/7. Amanda and Chris, weary from their 10-hour drive through the countryside, decided to stop there for a quick bite before pressing on to their destination. The parking lot was empty except for a single, rusted pickup truck. The couple exchanged uneasy glances before heading inside. The diner was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that clung to the air like a second skin. A single waitress stood behind the counter, her back to them, her movements slow and mechanical as she cleaned a glass. Her uniform was pristine, but there was something unsettling about how stiffly she moved. Amanda cleared her throat. "Excuse me, are you still serving?" The waitress turned around. Her face was pale, her eyes strangely glassy. "Sit anywhere you like," she said, her voice monotone. Chris shrugged, pulling Amanda toward a booth by the window. The laminated menu was sticky, the food choices outdated: meatloaf, liver and onions, creamed corn. They decided to keep it simple: 2 coffees and some toast. "Got it," the waitress said, not bothering to write it down. She shuffled off toward the kitchen. As they waited, Amanda glanced around. The walls were lined with faded photographs of smiling patrons and staff. But the more she stared, the more she noticed a strange pattern. The people in the photos were all looking directly at the camera, their smiles unnaturally wide, their eyes unblinking. One photo in particular made her shiver. A family of 4 sitting in the very booth they were in, their smiles strained, their eyes like empty voids. Chris noticed her unease. "What's wrong?" She pointed to the photo. "Doesn't that look weird to you?" He squinted. "It's just an old picture. This place is ancient, babe. Don't freak yourself out." The waitress returned with their coffee and toast, placing the plates on the table with a stiff, robotic motion. "Anything else?" she asked. Amanda hesitated. "No, this is fine. Thank you." The waitress nodded but didn't leave. She stood there, her glassy eyes fixed on Chris. After an uncomfortable moment, she turned and walked back behind the counter without another word. Chris leaned in, whispering, "Okay, that was creepy." They tried to eat, but the coffee tasted bitter, metallic. The toast was cold, the butter congealed into a waxy lump. They decided to leave, but as Chris reached for his wallet, the jukebox in the corner crackled to life. A low, distorted hum filled the air, followed by an old warbling tune. "I'll be seeing you." Amanda flinched. "What the hell?" The music grew louder, the sound crackling like static. Then the lights flickered, casting the room into shadow for a brief moment. When they came back on, the diner felt different. The photographs on the walls had changed. The people in them were gone. Only the empty backgrounds remained: booths, counters, the kitchen, but no smiling faces. Amanda's pulse raced. "Chris, we need to get out of here." He nodded, grabbing her hand, but as they stood, the door to the diner slammed shut with a deafening bang. The waitress was suddenly there, standing in front of the door, her glassy eyes unblinking. "You can't leave," she said, her voice layered as if more than one person were speaking through her. Chris moved forward, his voice shaking. "Lady, I don't know what's going on here, but we're leaving." The waitress tilted her head, her smile growing wider than should have been possible. "No one leaves." The jukebox grew louder, the warped song distorting until it sounded like screams. The lights flickered again, plunging the diner into darkness. When the lights came back on, the diner was full. The booths and stools were occupied by people, dozens of them, all staring at Amanda and Chris. Their faces were pale, their eyes voids of blackness, their mouths stretched into the same unnatural smiles as the people in the photos. Amanda recognized some of them, the family from the photo. The cook from behind the counter, even the man in the rusted pickup truck. Chris backed into her, his voice trembling. "What the hell is this?" The waitress stepped forward, her smile splitting her face. "You're part of it now." The crowd stood in unison, moving toward them in jerky, unnatural movements, their hollow eyes glinting in the fluorescent light. Amanda screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the jukebox, which had reached an ear-splitting crescendo. The last thing she saw was the camera flash. Weeks later, a trucker passing through the area stopped at Last Stop Cafe. He needed a break, and the warm light of the diner looked inviting. Inside, he was greeted by the waitress, her smile wide and lifeless. As he sat at the counter, he noticed the photographs on the wall. In one of them, a young couple sat in a booth by the window, their faces frozen in wide, unnatural smiles. The headlights sliced through the night, illuminating an endless stretch of road framed by towering trees. Emily, Sam, and David were 3 friends desperate for adventure, setting out on what they called the Ghostly Highway Challenge, a 200-mile stretch of road that had been the subject of countless urban legends. Every online forum and midnight podcast hinted at eerie sightings and chilling encounters. Skeptical but eager for thrills, the trio packed for the road trip, laughing at the idea that anything beyond their imagination could happen. They began their journey at dusk, with Emily at the wheel. The setting sun bathed the sky in crimson hues before darkness swallowed it whole. The radio emitted static, refusing to play anything coherent, as if rejecting their presence. David joked about it being a spooky radio curse, eliciting nervous laughter. But as miles passed, the unease grew. A peculiar fog descended, curling around the car like cold, damp tendrils. No other cars passed, and their phones lost all signal, locking them into isolation. Several hours in, a lone figure appeared on the shoulder, hunched over, wrapped in tattered cloth. Against better judgment, they stopped. The man raised his head, revealing a face pale and waxy, as if carved from candle wax. His eyes were blank pits. He opened his mouth, a hoarse whisper clawing its way out. "Turn back." Terrified, they sped off, the man's form vanishing in the mirror like an evaporating shadow. Their laughter was forced now. They dismissed the encounter, blaming exhaustion. But then the road changed. It stretched unnaturally long, lined with rusted road signs in unfamiliar languages. A low hum vibrated the car's metal frame, filling their chests with dread. As they drove, the trees lining the highway twisted grotesquely, branches resembling skeletal hands clawing at the sky. An hour later, the headlights caught another figure ahead, a woman in a torn white dress. Emily slammed on the brakes. The woman stood motionless in the middle of the road, her long, matted hair obscuring her face. Sam leaned out of the window and asked if she needed help. Her head snapped up with an unnatural jerk. Her eyes were deep red, and her mouth stretched into a gaping grin, too wide for her face. She screamed, a sound like metal scraping bone. Terrified, they reversed, tires squealing. The woman charged, her feet gliding over the pavement like a phantom. With the gas pedal floored, they managed to escape her inhuman pursuit. Silence returned, but not the comfort of safety. Sam, pale and sweating, swore he saw her reflection in the rearview mirror even after she was gone. Night turned to a cruel cycle, stretching on without end. The trio drove aimlessly, feeling like prey in a predator's maze. The car began to malfunction, headlights flickering, engine stalling at odd intervals. When they finally stopped to check, they discovered deep claw marks gouged into the car's metal frame. Something had been with them, close enough to touch. The final straw came when a sign loomed out of the darkness. "Welcome to Gravebend," it read, the town they had passed hours ago. Despair seeped into their bones. They were looping, trapped in an endless stretch of haunted highway. Then came the laughter, maniacal, echoing from the woods. Figures stepped onto the road, the wax-faced man, the woman with the twisted grin, and others cloaked in shadows, all staring, waiting. The trio never made it home. Locals whispered about the ghostly highway, how those who mocked its legends became part of them. Some claimed to hear desperate cries on the wind when driving that stretch at night. Others see fleeting glimpses of three friends, frozen in time, driving forever into the heart of a nightmare. The ghostly highway claimed another tale to be whispered by firelight and feared by the daring. Would you dare test its legend? The midnight air was thick with tension as Brian, Marie, and their friend Jason set out on a road trip through Hollow Creek Pass, a remote stretch of highway notorious for disappearances and sinister lore. Stories spoke of people who vanished without a trace, their cars later found abandoned, engines still running. The three laughed nervously at the tales, but they all felt it. Something was different here. Halfway through their journey, the road grew rougher, almost as if it were resisting them. No moonlight pierced the canopy of twisted trees overhead, and the oppressive darkness seemed alive. They noticed strange symbols carved into the bark, none of which any of them recognized. Marie dismissed it with a nervous shrug, but Jason swore he saw fresh blood dripping from one. They sped up. As they drove deeper, the temperature dropped suddenly. A wave of nausea hit them, accompanied by the stench of decay. The radio crackled, and then a voice, low and garbled, whispered, "Turn back. Too late." Jason tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. The voice came again, louder this time, mocking their fear. Brian switched the radio off, but the whisper continued, now coming from the air itself, filling the car. The road curved sharply, and their headlights illuminated a woman standing in the middle of the road, pale, barefoot, and dripping wet as though she'd been drowned. Brian swerved, narrowly missing her, but when they stopped, she was gone. The moment they stepped out of the car, she appeared behind them. Her eyes were hollow pits, and when she spoke, water poured from her mouth, soaking the ground at their feet. "You shouldn't be here," she rasped, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. Her limbs jerked with unnatural movements as she approached. They scrambled back to the car, slamming the doors just in time. Brian floored the gas, but their wheels spun uselessly. The asphalt had turned to thick mud, sucking them in. The woman's face appeared at the window, her bony hand tapping on the glass. "They're waiting for you." With a sickening lurch, the car was wrenched backward, dragged by an unseen force. The trees shifted, their branches coiling like serpents. Shadows emerged from the darkness, grotesque figures with twisted, broken limbs and faces that no longer resembled anything human. Their eyes glowed with malevolent light as they reached for the car. Maurice screamed, and for a split second, the shadows hesitated. Jason remembered the stories, whispered warnings of those who encountered these beings and escaped by sheer luck or desperate acts of bravery. He grabbed a lighter and sprayed deodorant from his backpack, creating a burst of flame that sent the figures retreating. The mud released the tires, and Brian drove forward, adrenaline and fear battling for control. They sped down the road, trees clawing at the car, whispers deafening in their ears. The figures followed, keeping pace, their laughter echoing from all directions. As dawn approached, the road led them back to the edge of Hollow Creek Pass. But before they crossed, the voice returned, chilling and final. "You've left nothing behind but time. We'll see you again." When they reached safety, the trio fell into stunned silence. Their car was covered in handprints, scorched into the paint. They never spoke of that night again, but locals say they were never the same. Hollow Creek's curse lingers still, and every few years, new whispers surface of travelers who disappear, leaving only horror in their wake. Would you dare cross Hollow Creek Pass alone?